Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more Esoterica. Today we are diving back into the works of Rudolf Steiner. This is Building Stones for an Understanding of the Mystery of Golgotha Lecture 9. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It's not the format for everybody, but some people get enjoyment out of it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in the terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, the box below, along with the original source material so that you can get a better understanding why I say those things that make you so upset. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of building stones for an understanding of the mystery of Golgotha, Lecture 10, May 1st, 1917, Berlin. In the course of our studies, I have spoken on the events in the early development of Western civilization. My aim was to ascertain from these inquiries into the past what is of importance for the present, and with this object in view, I propose to pursue the matter in further detail. Our present epoch, as far as we can see from a cursory glance, is an epoch when only thoughts derived from the mystery teachings concerning human evolution can exercise effective influence. Now, wait, what? Is an epoch when only thoughts derived from the mystery teachings concerning human evolution can exercise effective influence. But literally for the last 100 years, those have been ignored completely. So I don't quite understand how you can even make that statement. Now, in order to grasp the full implication of this claim, we must not only have a clear understanding of many things, but we must also look closely into the needs and shortcomings of contemporary thinking, feeling, and willing. We shall then begin to feel that our present epoch has need of new impulses, new thoughts and ideas, and especially of those impulses and thoughts which spring from the depths of the spiritual life and which must become the subject of spiritual scientific study. At the present time, there is much that fills us with sadness. We must not allow ourselves to be depressed by this mood of sadness. Rather, it should be something that can prepare us and teach us to work and strive in our present circumstances. I recently came across a publication which I felt would give me the greatest pleasure. The author is one of the few who are receptive to the ideas of spiritual science, and the more is the pity that he was unable to introduce into his writings the fruits of anthroposophical endeavor. The book to which I am referring is The State as Organism by Rudolf Kjellin. Y'all let me know down below to remember to look that up and put it on the list, please. Rudolf Kjellin, 1864 to 1922, was a Swedish historian and a professor at Uppsala. Belonged to the school of geopolitics, the doctrine of the interaction of geographical and political factors in the constitution and development of states. The Swedish political economist. After reading the book, I must confess that I was left with a feeling of disappointment because I realized that here was a person who, as I said, was receptive to the ideas of spiritual science, but whose thoughts were still far removed from the thoughts we stand in need of today. Thoughts which must be clearly formulated and become concrete reality, especially today, so that they may enter into the evolution of our time. In his book, Kjellin undertook to study the state and its organization, but at no time does one feel that he possessed the ideas or the intellectual grasp which could offer the slightest chance of solving his problem. It is a melancholy experience to be disillusioned time and again. But let us not be discouraged. Let us rather brace ourselves to meet the challenge of our time. Before I say a few words on these matters, I should like to call your attention, once again, to those ancient mysteries, which, as you can well imagine from the statements I recently made about iconoclasm of the Christian Church, are known to history today in only a mangled version. It is all the more necessary, therefore, for our present age that spiritual science should bring an understanding to these mysteries. I mentioned in my last lecture the unprecedented fury with which Christianity in the first centuries destroyed the ancient works of art, and how much that was of priceless value was swept away. One cannot take an impartial view of Christianity unless one is prepared to see the destructive side with complete objectivity. That is true. And bear in mind at the same time that the various books which deal with this subject present a particular point of view. Everyone today who has received a minimum of education has a picture of the spiritual development of antiquity, of the spiritual evolution that preceded Christianity. That is not true for today. There is so much ignorance today that it is quite astounding, actually. But how different the picture would be if Archbishop Theophilus, note 2, of Alexandria, let's go ahead and pop that out and see, Theophilus, Patriarch of Alexandria, 385 to 412, he condemned Origen at the Synod of Alexandria in 408. He deprived the pagans of Alexandria of a temple, and apparently destroyed other temples. A riot ensued, and a number of Christians were slain. With Theophilus at their head, the Christians retaliated by destroying the celebrated temple of Serapis, on the ruins of which the Patriarch erected a church. Quotation from the Catholic Encyclopedia, Volume 14, 1913. But how different this picture would be if Archbishop Theophilus of Alexandria had not burnt in the year 391 700,000 scrolls which contained vitally important records of Roman, Egyptian, Indian, and Greek literature and their cultural life. And I maintain that these were probably not burned. This is a conspiracy within my conspiratorial mind, but they are most certainly underneath the church in Rome. Just imagine how different would be the picture of antiquity if these 700,000 scrolls had not been burnt. And from this you will realize how much reliance can be placed on the history of the past, which has documentary support, or rather how little reliance. Let us now follow up the train of thought which I touched on in my lecture yesterday. I pointed out that the forms of Christian worship were in many respects borrowed from the symbols and ceremonies of the ancient pagan mystery cults, that the forms of these mystery cults and symbols had been totally eradicated by Christianity in order to conceal their origin. Christianity made a clean sweep of the pagan forms of worship so that people had no means of knowing what had existed prior to their time and would simply have to accept what the church offered. Such is the fate of human evolution. We must be prepared to recognize, without giving way to pessimism, that the course of human evolution is not one of uninterrupted progress. There are leaps forward and leaps backwards. And sometimes the great leap forward is actually a leap backwards. I also showed in the course of my lecture yesterday that the rites and rituals of the Roman Church owed much to the Eleusinian mysteries, which had been interrupted in their development because Julian had been unable to carry out his intentions. He got assassinated while he was attempting to do so by most likely the church. His plan had failed to materialize. But the rites and sacraments of later years owed still more to the Mithras mysteries. But the spirit of the Mithras mysteries, that which justified their existence, the source from which they derived their spiritual content, can no longer be investigated. The church has been careful to remove all traces of it and to close the door to inquiry. Knowledge of this can only be recovered if we strive to come to an understanding of these things through spiritual science. It's important to note, right, there is an awful lot of narcissism in the church. There is an awful lot of, if you question this, you're condemned to hell. That is a thing. And if you do not fully accept, if you do not fully believe, you are punished. That is narcissism in its purest form. And so it is important to note that that is the history of the church. All the way back as far as the history extends, the church has been doing that. If you don't believe this, then you're condemned to hell. You're excommunicated. You're not allowed to do things. It has been a manipulative effort all the way through. Today I propose to touch upon only one aspect of the Mithras mysteries. This is going to be note 3. The Mithras initiation, according to R.J. Vermaseren, in Mithras, the Secret God, Chatto and Windus, 1963, he who had acquired sufficient knowledge could gain successively the title of Raven, Corax, Bride, Nymphus, Soldier, Miles, Lion, Leo, Persian, Parisses, Courier of the Sun, Heliodromus, and Father Pater. This book is a classic in the study of Mithraism, and there are figures in the text and illustration. Remind me also to check that one out. I'll try to remember to get it on the list, but I will probably forget. In order to grasp the true spirit of the Mithras mysteries, whose influence spread far into the west of Europe during the first post-Christian centuries, we must be aware that they were based upon a central core of belief, which was right for the world of antiquity and perfectly justified up to the time of the Mystery of Golgotha. That the community, or the individual communities, for example, the folk communities or other groups within the folk communities, consisted not only of the individual units or members, but that if they were to have any reality, communities must be imbued with a community spirit, which has a supersensible origin. A community was determined not only by the counting of heads, but for the people of antiquity, it represented the external form, the incarnation, if I may use the word in this connection, of a genuinely existing communal spirit. The aim of those who were received into these mysteries was to participate in this spirit, to share the thoughts of this group soul, not to insulate themselves from the community by obstinately pursuing their own egoistic thoughts, feelings, and volitional impulses, but to live in such a way that they were receptive to the thoughts of the group soul. That would be communism. Right, you should be aware, right? You should be, I believe in communalism, right? Not communism, but communalism. Living communally. That means with your neighbors. And that is, I grow this plant, you grow that plant, we share these plants, and together we prosper. If you have a need, I'm helped to meet that need, and together we prosper. So you should be community-minded, yes. But not to the point of giving away everything, right? Not to, you can be receptive to the thoughts of the group soul, but you should definitely keep your individualism intact. In the Mithras mysteries, in particular, the priests maintain that this union with the group soul cannot be achieved if one looks upon a larger community simply as an external manifestation. For thereby, that which lies in the community spirit is in the main obscured. The dead, they claimed, are part of our immediate environment, and the more we can commune with those who have long been dead, the better we shall order our present life. No. Unequivocally, 100% no. You should not be communing with the dead. Like, we have talked about this before, and it is entirely possible to leave this mortal coil, right? Your soul, the individualized piece that is you, can hold on to bitterness and resentment and uncompletion and all of those things and decide to stay here. But if that happens, it is almost always going to be a malevolent spirit. It is almost always going to be centered towards the not good. You shouldn't be talking to them. The ones who have left, you're probably not talking to them. Like almost certainly they go, they get back to source, and then they make the turnaround and they come back. It is a voluntary experience. It is not a prison planet, but most souls are going to choose to return, and there's no real reason for delay in that happening. So you are almost certainly not talking to who you think you are. There are entities out there, however, and they can imitate quite well your desires. They can almost read your thoughts. And so you should be extremely careful if you were talking with anyone who has passed on. Therefore, the longer these souls have been discarnate, the more beneficial they found it to commune with these souls. And again, no. And in order to be able to commune with the spirit of the ancestor of a tribe, folk community, or family, they found it best to make contact with the ancestral soul. It was assumed that this soul develops further after passing through the gates of death and therefore has a deeper insight into the future destiny of the earth than those who are living on the earth in their present physical bodies. Now that part I believe is true, right? I believe that when you return to source, you get all the answers to all the questions. It is an instantaneous knowing. You don't even have to ask questions. All of the events in your life, you get to see why they unfolded in the way that they did. You get to see the choices that you made in order to make it unfold in that way. And then you get to make the decision to come back again if you wish. I do believe that most souls do make that that their explicit wish, right? It's just possible that people stay with Source, but it is not likely. Thus, the whole purpose of these mysteries was to establish those dramatic representations which would put the neophyte in touch with the souls of those who had long passed through the gates of death. So they are oriented wrong. Right? You can seek Source, you can seek God, you will receive your answer from there. That is where you should be going. Those who were admitted to these mysteries had to undergo a first stage of initiation, which was usually characterized by a term borrowed from the bird species. They were called ravens. A raven was a first-degree initiate. Through the particular mystery rites, through the potent use of symbols, and especially through dramatic performances, he became aware not only of the sensible world around him, or of what one learns through contact with one's fellow men, but also the thoughts of the dead. He acquired a certain capacity which enabled him to recall memories of the dead and the ability to develop it further. The raven was under the solemn obligation to be conscious in the moment, to be alert and responsive to the world around, to be aware of the needs of his fellow men, and to familiarize himself with the phenomena of nature. He who spends his life in daydreaming, who has no feeling for the indwelling spirit of man in nature, was considered to be unsuitable material for reception into the mysteries, for only the ability to see life around him clearly and in its true perspective fitted him for the task which he had to fulfill in the mysteries. His task was to participate as far as possible in the changing circumstances of the world in order to widen the range of his experience, to share in the joys and sorrows of contemporary events. He who was unresponsive or indifferent to contemporary events was an unsuitable candidate for initiation. For the first task of the aspirant was to reproduce, to reenact in the mysteries the experiences gained through the participation in the life of the world. In this way, these experiences served as a channel of communication with the dead with whom the initiates sought to make contact. Now you might ask, would not a high initiate have been more suitable for this purpose? By no means, for the first-degree initiates were eminently suited to act as intermediaries because they still possessed all their feelings, shared all the sympathies and antipathies which fitted them for life in the external world, which you should not be shedding, right? They should not rule you, but you should always share the sympathies and antipathies which fit you for life in the external world. That is not something that you should be attempting to get rid of. The effect upon you, yes. The actual thing that's happening, no. You should be feeling your feelings. You should be engaged in those, and you should not be attempting to remove yourself from those. Whilst the higher initiates had more or less purged themselves of those emotions. Exactly, you should not be doing that. Do not be ruled by them. You are still going to feel anger, but you should not be ruled by anger. Wrath should not be your recourse. Jealousy and lust should not be your recourse. But you're still going to feel those things. You should be in mastery of them, but not removed from them. That is an important distinction, even though it is a slight one, right? It is a hairbreadth difference, but that hairbreadth makes a large difference in many cases. Therefore, these first-degree initiates were specially suited to experience contemporary life in terms of the ordinary man and to incorporate it into the mysteries. It was therefore the special task of the ravens to mediate between the external world and those long dead. The tradition has survived in legend. As I have often stated, legends as a rule have deep implications. The Kyffhäuser legend tells how Frederick Barbarossa, who had long been dead, is instructed by ravens, or how Charles the Great in the Salzburg-Unstersburg is surrounded by ravens that brought him news of the outside world. These are echoes of the ancient pagan mysteries, and especially in the Mithras mysteries. That is most likely going to be a self-insertion, right? Ravens have spiritual context. They do. It's because they're an intelligent bird. They are trainable. You can take and place things outside and train a raven to bring you things. They can even be taught to speak in limited form. And so that is where the legend of the ravens. Now, it may be attached to the Mithras mysteries, but it is a fairly universal myth, right? It is not exclusive to the area where Mithras was a thing. It is something that is pretty close to worldwide. Everywhere they have ravens, this is one of the things. Ravens and their mystery. Now, people attach that to the dark side, but other people attach that to the light side. So, personally, I don't believe you're going to get a whole lot of wisdom from a bird, but some people want to listen to them according to legends. But it is most likely because they are a very intelligent bird. You can train them where you cannot train a swallow. When the aspirant was ready for the second degree of initiation, he became an adept, or occultist, as we should say today. He was then not only able not only to incorporate into the mysteries his experience in the sensible world, but also to receive clairvoyantly the communications from the dead. The impulses which the supersensible world, this world of concrete reality which the dead inhabit, had to impart to the external world. Only when he was fully integrated into the spiritual life which originates in the supersensible and is related to the external sensible world was he considered to be adequately prepared for the third degree. And he was now given the opportunity to give practical expression to the impulses he had received in the mysteries. He was now singled out to become a warrior, one who mediates to the sensible world that which must be revealed from the supersensible world. But was it not a gross injustice, you may ask, to withhold vital information from the people and to initiate only a select few? Yes. You will only understand the reason for this if you accept what I stated at the outset, namely, that the people were dependent upon a group soul and were content for these select few to act on the behalf of the whole community. Laziness is no excuse. They did not look upon themselves as separate individuals, but as members of a group. It was only possible, therefore, to pursue this policy of selection at a time when the existence of a group soul, when the selfless identification with the group was a living reality. And when, as a warrior, the initiate had championed for a time the cause of the supersensible, he was considered fitted to establish smaller groups within the framework of the larger group, smaller communities within larger groups as the need arose. If, in those ancient times, anyone had taken into his head to found an association on his own initiative, he would have been ignored. Nothing would have come of it. In order to establish a union or association, the initiate must become a lion, as it was termed in the Mithras mysteries, for that was the fourth degree of initiation. He must not have reinforced his spiritual life through association with those impulses which existed not only amongst the living, but which united the living with the dead. From the fourth degree, the initiate rose to a higher degree of initiation, which permitted him, through certain measures, to take over the leadership of an already existing group, a folk community in which the dead also participated. The 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries before the Mystery of Golgotha are totally different from those of today. It would never have occurred to anyone to claim the right to choose arbitrarily the leader of their community. Such a leader had to be an initiate of the 5th degree. I would like to see the documentation of this. Then, at the next higher degree, the initiate attained to the insights which the Sun mystery, of which he had recently received intimations, implanted in the human soul. Finally, he attained the 7th degree of initiation. I do not propose to enter into the details of these later degrees of initiation, for I simply wish to characterize the progressive development of an initiate who owed his contact with the spiritual world his capacity to take an active part in community life. Now you know that the group soul nature has gradually declined in accordance with the necessary law of human evolution. No, that was entropy due to apathy, right? We become less concerned over time, apparently, with keeping people on the moral path. It seems to be a repeated pattern throughout history, one we are currently undergoing, and which will probably end not as well as we would like. All right, I believe there's a bottleneck coming. see the 12,000 year disaster cycle. And I believe on the other side of that, we will have a new paradigm. And so, yeah, there will be something, but that will be a reset to the point where we have to make people live by morals again. Communities will be so small that they will be able to police themselves effectively once again, and peer pressure will again be a thing. And one of the reasons why I do this is so that when that happens, it is with actual practicable application, as opposed to let's talk to dead people, because that's not really going to get you there, right? You can do it, but it's dumb. You should instead be seeking source and getting your information directly from the Lord God Almighty himself. He who was, is, and always shall be the entire creator of the entire universe. Not some piece of him who died several centuries ago and is probably bitter if they're still hanging around. Or at worst, an entity who is trying to deceive you. It was at the time of the Mystery of Golgotha that man first developed ego consciousness. That is dumb. Man. Like, I hate to couch it like that, right? I try to couch it in love. But that is dumb. Man was first able to ascertain that I am me. Then, man, you need to read the Old Testament. You need to look back and see how many I am me's there are in that. David, Samson, Jeremiah, like there are a whole lot of people in that who were very much aware of their ego, very much aware. Now, they may not have had the terminology that we use, but there is no way that this is even close to being true. Not even slightly, right? Even assuming that the Mithras and the Eleusinian cults and all of those things are true, they had to be aware of the fact that they were them before they could even be a part of the other. It is not even a thing that this is even possible. This had been prepared for centuries, but the crisis, the critical moment in this development, had been reached at the time of the Mystery of Golgotha. One can, the self-insertion there, right? Like, well, it's been prepared for centuries. So all of these people that knew about the ego in themselves, right? They are, I am me. That's been prepared for centuries. But you can't understand it until this one event happens 4,000 years down the road. One could no longer assume that the individual had the power to carry the whole community with him, to transfer his feelings and impulses to the entire community with a spirit of altruism. It would be foolish to imagine that the course of history could have been other than it has been, but sometimes a thought such as the following may prove fruitful. What would have happened if, at the time when the message of Christianity first made its impact on human evolution, the pagan traditions had not been eradicated root and branch, but if historically a certain knowledge, which would be transparent even to those who relied on documents, had been transmitted to posterity, then Christianity would not have flourished. Like, if there was another path by which you could produce actual results, then Christianity would not have done what it did. It just wouldn't have happened. I understand that probably just stepped on some toes, and again, I don't mean to, but it is not something I apologize for. If, instead of Christianity and the need to give away that which you are truly responsible for, if that had not have been a thing, then you would have been responsible. It would have been you who had to make the sacrifices. It would be you that had to make the corrections. It would be you that had to make the atonement. And it was you. We have progressed, true, but not spiritually. Not at all. We have not progressed spiritually at all due to the advent of Christianity. But Christianity was opposed to such a possibility because it would not have been possible for there to be Christianity, right? The things that we talk about here, the spiritual science, this is witchcraft. Do not get it twisted. It is classified as witchcraft by the Christians, by the Jewish. It is classified that way. The things that are possible are called witchcraft. Now, Jesus practiced them. Moses practiced them. Miriam practiced them. Aaron practiced them, right? These things, Elijah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, all practiced witchcraft. But because they were aligned correctly, it wasn't labeled that way. And you were taught that it's not. It was from God. Well, witchcraft is from God. Now, that is not to say that all forms of witchcraft, right? There are people out there performing rituals and things with salt and wands and calling upon entities' names and doing things. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the manipulation of the subtle field. I am talking about healing people. I am talking about clairvoyance and seeing things. These things are possible. These are things that you can do. But if you do them, they are excluded from you by Christianity. It is given to Jesus to do for you, right? Well, Jesus, can you heal this person for me? That is not the same as you are healed. That is a different thing. We will discuss later the reason for this attitude. Today, I wish simply to register the fact that Christianity was opposed to the transmission of this knowledge. And that's why they burned scrolls, right? Burned. They know, like, they're the people that have these things, in my estimation, in my conspiratorial mind, the people who have these scrolls tucked away, and it may not even be the original scrolls by this point, but you can bet your butt they got copies of it everywhere. Those people know what's in them scrolls. They teach their club what's in them scrolls. They just keep it from you. Much in the same way as being described here about these secret societies throughout the ages. The church is a secret society. They have a front presenting, this is what we do, and then they have a behind the scenes, this is what we really do. Right? They're not telling you they're running around out here fighting demons, but you can find out about it if you look. There are secret knowledges, and Christianity in large is one of the reasons. Now, Islam and Christianity peas in a pod on this. Getting rid of history. They want to get rid of things which contradict the thing they want you to believe. They don't want you to see any other alternatives. That is a truth. That is not even in my conspiratorial mind. Thus, Christianity was confronted by a totally different kind of humanity, which was not so much attached to the group souls as that of former times. A humanity in which the approach to the individual had to be totally different from that of ancient times, when the individual was virtually ignored and when men looked to the group soul for guidance and acted out of the group soul. Through the fact that Christianity suppressed all documentary evidence of the early centuries, the people were kept in ignorance. Christianity, in fact, consciously fostered ignorance on the epoch when it had first developed. Truth. This Christianity borrowed those aspects of the pagan teachings which served its purpose and incorporated them in its traditions and dogmas, and especially in its cults or religious ceremonies, and then effaced all traces of the origin of these cults. The ancient cults have a deep symbolic meaning, but Christianity gave them a different interpretation. The performance of cult acts or ceremonies was still a familiar sight, but the source of the primeval wisdom from which they derived was concealed from the people. Take, for example, the bishop's mitre of the 8th century. This mitre was embroidered with swastikas, which were arranged in different patterns. The swastika, which was originally the crux grammatra, dates back to the earliest mysteries, to the ancient times, when man was able to observe the activity of the lotus flowers in the human etheric and astral organism. You still can. How that which was active in the lotus flower was one of the chief manifestations of the etheric and astral forces. The bishop wore the swastika as a symbol of his authority, but its significance was lost and had become a dead symbol. All traces of its origins had been eradicated. What history tells us of the origin of such symbols is only dry bones. Only through spiritual science can we rediscover the living spiritual element in these things. And keep in mind that while the swastika was appropriated by the funny mustache man way back in this time period, right? And within a couple of years, that was going to rise to the fore. But it was inverted. It was shown to be a different thing, and there is significant reason to believe that the original swastika was a sign that appeared in the heavens, probably around the Eden event. Now, I said earlier that people were consciously kept in ignorance, but the time has now come to dispel this ignorance. That's what we're here for. And over the years, I think I have said enough, and in a variety of ways, to show that it is essential at the present time to be alive and alert to these questions. For our epoch is an epoch in which the necessary period of darkness has run its course, and when the light of spiritual life must dawn again. It is devoutly to be wished that as many as possible should feel in their hearts that this spiritual light is a necessity for our time, and that the failures and endless sufferings of our time are connected with all these questions. We shall realize that superficial judgments are inadequate when we come to speak of the causes of our present situation. So long as we speak only from a superficial standpoint, we shall be unable to develop thoughts or impulses which are sufficiently potent to dispel the ignorance which is the source of our attendant ills. It is, indeed, remarkable how mankind today, but this need not depress us, rather it should encourage us to observe and understand our present condition, is unwilling to face up to the situation because, for the most part, man is as yet unable to perceive what is really necessary for our evolution. It is heartbreaking to see what Nietzsche felt about the prevailing darkness and confusion of our age, a man who suffered deeply from and was driven to the point of madness by the chaos and confusion of the second half of the 19th century. We have dealt with Nietzsche and his tendency towards depression in the playlist. We shall not come to terms with a personality such as Friedrich Nietzsche if we look upon him as someone whom one blindly follows, as so many have done, for he answered these blind followers in the original prelude to the gay science, that is not gay as we define it today. I am sufficient unto myself, I owe allegiance to none, and I laugh at every master who cannot laugh at himself. This is also the underlying mood of the whole of Thus Spake Zarathustra, that is the work that we went through. But it did not prevent Nietzsche from being surrounded by many who were merely hangers-on. They, in any case, had nothing positive to contribute to our present situation. But the other extremists, and between these two groups can be found every shade of opinion, are equally of no help. For they say that although Nietzsche had many creative ideas, he ultimately lost his reason and so can be safely ignored. It is entirely possible that Nietzsche suffered from spatial dementia, right? He lost his ability to do things, but it was probably due to a stroke. He had a tendency to be addicted to things, and that may have played a part. He had a tendency to overexert himself. That may have played a part. He had a tendency to seek but not find enlightenment, and that may have played a part. And he may have found that switch and not hit it correctly. That could also have played a part. That is all speculation, but they are all very valid possibilities. Friedrich Nietzsche is a strange phenomenon. One need not be his willing slave. Yet the fact remains that even in his period of mental sickness, he was acutely sensitive to the darkness and chaos of the age. You should definitely fall back to the Nietzsche study. I got annoyed by the end of it because it was a bit repetitive by the end of the Thus Spake Zarathustra, but it began on a very enlightening note. Indeed, the account of the distress which Nietzsche suffered in his time provides us with a good yardstick with which to measure the difficulties of our own time. I propose to read two passages from Nietzsche's posthumous writings, The Will to Power, The Transvaluation of All Values. Note 4, let's go ahead and pop that out. Nietzsche, The Will to Power and the Transvaluation of All Values, according to P. Tillich. Will here means the universal dynamics of all life processes and power, the affirmation of one's individual existence. It is the power of the best. The transvaluation of all values implies that since God is dead, i.e., that traditional and ethical values no longer stem from the belief in a transcendent authority. Man himself must recreate them. And that is a good bit of misinterpretation, right? Not entirely, but Nietzsche didn't say God is dead as though it was a good thing. He did say that it was because of society, right? That is what this is talking about. But God didn't die. Man just quit listening. So there's a big difference there. Man decided that he was more important than the source, and so he separated himself from all references to source. And Nietzsche was lamenting the fact that people did that. The Übermensch must be developed. He is the superior man, physically, mentally, and spiritually, the man of self-discipline who has learned to command and obey, to accept responsibility, whose watchword is duty and honor. It is an aristocratic ideal. No. According to, aristocratic implies that it is nobility. It is something for the people who are better than you, and that is simply not true. It is something for everyone. Every man has the potential to be an Übermensch. But it takes dedication, right? We talk all the time about prayer, fasting, and meditation. We talk about the fact that you should be refining your temple into the best version of it that you can possibly do. You should feed it good things. You should exercise regularly to the point of perspiration and stretching your muscles and building and developing them. You should be studying. You should be articulating arguments with people who disagree with you. You should be striving to be the best man that you can possibly be. And that is the Übermensch. And that should be everybody. Everybody should be doing that. Now, will everybody do that? No. Is it reserved to the nobility? Abso-fucking-lutely not. According to Nietzsche, his antitype is mass man, the herd man, who has succumbed to ideologies that promised happiness and well-being, Christianity. He is timid, bored, conformist, opposed to tradition and culture. This slave morality is utilitarian and keeps only its own advantage in view and prepares the ochlocracy, the nihilism towards which we are moving. Page 13 in the English text. Which was written at a time when his mind was unhinged. Passages which could have been written today and with a wholly different intent than Nietzsche's, and could have been written to expose the deeper underlying cause of our present situation. Nietzsche wrote, "What I am about to relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I shall describe what is foreshadowed and from which there is no escape, the triumph of nihilism. This history can be written now, for necessity is already at work here. The future is already presaged by 100 different omens. This destiny announced is its presence everywhere. For the music of tomorrow all ears are prickled. The whole of European culture is slowly moving towards catastrophe in an agony of suspense, which increases from decade to decade. Restless, violent, precipitate, like a river and spot, hastening to its ocean bed, and which refuses to reflect and even dreads reflection. Judge then of your own reactions in the light of these words from a pen of a man with rare sensitivity at the end of the 80s of the 19th century, and compare these words with another passage which I will now read to you, and which vividly portrays the deep distress he felt, and which everyone can experience himself. My friends, we had a hard time in our youth. We even suffered from youth as it were a serious disease. This is owing to the age in which we are born. The age of great internal decay and disintegration, which, with all its weakness and even with the best of strength, is opposed to the spirit of youth. Disintegration, that is to say, a sense of insecurity, is peculiar to our age. No, nothing stands on solid ground or on sound faith or belief. People live for the morrow, because the day after tomorrow is uncertain. Our path is slippery and dangerous, and the ice that still bears us has become precariously thin. We all feel the mild and ominous breath of the thaw wind. Within a short space of time, the path we are treading will never be able to know the footsteps of man again. No. Now, is there a spirit of great internal decay and disintegration? Yes. Is it unique to this particular point in time? No. Man has not really changed in his internal workings, right? We talk all of the time. If I was to pull Ezekiel from the past and set him next to me, he wouldn't be able to see or understand what we are looking at. But if I was to go back there, I would find this, right? I would find great internal decay and disintegration. That's what Ezekiel was lamenting about. That's what Jeremiah lamented about. That's what the prophets were talking about. Everybody's falling away from our traditions. It's literally the same thing in every age. That is the progress of humanity. Our goal should be to make sure that what we are falling away from is the wrong things and what we are falling into are the right things. Now, that's highly subjective. Morality changes. Those things are true. But it should be our goal. We should understand that it is always going to happen. Entropy is a real thing. So we should be paying attention to it, but not thinking that we are particular in it. It's not peculiar to our age. It's really not. It is clear that these sentiments were born of a profound insight into the realities of the time. He who would understand the age in which we live, and especially the task that faces the individual, he who can look beyond the moment and the day, will himself feel what is expressed in those passages and will perhaps say. Nietzsche's mental derangement prevented him from adopting a critical attitude to the ideas which arose in him. Nonetheless, these ideas stem from an acute sensitivity to the immediate realities of the present age. Perhaps we shall one day draw a comparison between Nietzsche's response to his age and the customary pronouncements of experts, which do not even touch the fringe of the causes which lie at the root of our present difficult times. We shall then change our attitude and see the necessity for spiritual science today. People are unwilling to listen to the teachings of spiritual science, but in saying this I have no wish to imply reproach. Far be it from me to attach blame to anyone. The people to whom I am referring are, for the most part, those whom I feel great respect and who, in my opinion, would be the first to take spiritual science. I simply wish to point out how difficult it is for the individual to be receptive to spiritual science if he is impervious to spiritual appeal. If he can succumb entirely to the zeitgeist, to the superficial trends of the time, one must be fully aware of this. At this juncture, I can now revert to Kielland's book, The State as Organism. It is a curious book because the author strives with every fiber of his being to clarify the question, what is the state in reality? And because he does not believe in the capacity of man's ideas and concepts to understand this question. It is true that the book contains many fine things which have been praised by contemporary critics, but the author has not the slightest idea of the deeper layers of understanding and knowledge which are necessary in order to rescue mankind from its present predicament. I have only time to refer to the central theme of this book. Kielland raises the question, what is the relation of the individual to the state? And in attempting to answer this question, he immediately came up against a difficulty. He wished to depict the state as a reality, as an integrated whole. In other words, as an organism primarily. Many have already described the state as an organism and are then always faced with the question, an organism consists of cells. What then are the cells of the state? Clearly the individual members of the state, and on the whole, Kielland also shared this view. The state is an organism as the human or animal organism is an organism. And just as the human organism consists of individual cells, so too the state consists of individual cells of human beings who are cells of the state. I'm going to point you to one of my videos. I did a reaction video to a movie called The State of Jones. I think that's what it's called. And it was basically The State is Bad movie. Now, I understand the sentiments of that. I once was there. I used to be slightly anarchistic, but I'm not nearly anymore. And when I was heavily involved in illegal activities, so there is that. Take it with a grain of salt. But the state is going to be Now, what the state is going to be is dependent upon us. But regardless, you will never eradicate yourself from the state, right? You can believe that you are living a voluntary life out in the middle of nowhere, but you are still paying taxes, so therefore you are still part of the state. And you can believe elections don't mean nothing. There's no point in voting. There is just going to be what it's going to be, and I have no influence whatsoever. You can believe that. Or you can become an active participant in it because the state is going to be there regardless, and they will make things that apply to you. And you can either actively work towards the state that you wish to see, to be an active organism within the state, or you can be a passive member of the state, and the organism will do what it wants. And it may or may not be what you wish it to be. I don't believe that we have currently enacted the perfect system, but it is closer to perfect than anything we have had prior to. The fact that we do have representation and that they are held accountable by us if we hold them accountable is a wonderful thing. The days of the nobility ruling and that being fine are long past, but now we've got the understanding that the state is supposed to be our protector. And in part it is, right? The state exists for two main reasons. To keep us from being invaded by other people, and to ensure our freedoms from within ourselves. That is the only two true reasons for the state to exist. It should keep us from being antagonized by people who exist outside of our organism, and it should keep the cancers within our organism from overtaking the organism. All other parts of that are really violations of what it is intended to do. Most of what we do here in our state, the United States of America, is in alignment with that, or it has been. But it has not been perfectly executed. I don't even try to make that seem like it is a thing. I don't think that either side has gotten it right. I live in the middle. I am very much a middle-of-the-road person. I vote conservative these days because the other side is a little bit insane. And I don't want that organism to grow into communism, which is a terrible thing. The best that we can hope for is that we have an accountable state, that we have a state that answers to the people. Our problem is that we want to push that off onto other people, the holding them accountable part, right? We say, well, it doesn't make any difference if we vote, and therefore it doesn't. But if you are unhappy with the things that are happening in your area, then you should be making your voice loudly heard. But nobody is going to listen to you if you do not participate in the system. I don't mean this to be a defense of the state, but the state is a fact. It is something that will be. It may break apart. We could break into 50 individual states, and the very first thing that will happen is we will be attacked somewheres, and somebody's going to take a piece of that. Most likely it will be Texas, and I know the Texans are going to get real big mad because they hold most of the guns, right? Almost everybody in Texas is armed, and most of the others, like there are other states that are the same, but Texas is big. But if the full weight and force of the United States government was not behind Texas, then Mexico and the cartels associated with it would most definitely reclaim that state. And then it would be a slow progression of other states falling one by one. There would be a state taking over another state. I have no doubts whatsoever that New York, for instance, with its propensity towards authoritarianism, would try to take over Maryland, would try to take over Delaware, would try to take over something attached to it that is really tiny. Well, we could use that land, and we're a better guardian than you are, so we're just going to take it. That is what would happen. That is an extrapolation, right? That is me forecasting. That is me assuming, but it is a well-founded, well-researched assumption. I don't necessarily like the state, but if we can contain the state within the two functions that it is supposed to have, we would be a lot better off. If we could get away from we need to take care of everybody. That is something that is not the responsibility of the state. That is the responsibility of us as individuals. If my neighbor is in need, it is my responsibility to take care of that, not the state's. We have shoved off onto the state the responsibility that should be ours. That is the exact same feeling I have for Christianity. We have pushed off onto Jesus the things which should be us. We should be responsible for making atonement to God. We should be responsible for turning and doing the correct thing and not expecting that it's going to happen because this organization is going to make it happen. A bit of a sidetrack, but a necessary one, because we are talking about the state, right? The state is an organism. It will exist. And if this state disappears, a new one will form. And we will probably have less control of it. One can hardly imagine a more misguided or misleading analogy. If we follow up the analogy, we shall never arrive at a clear understanding of man. Why is this? The cells of the human organism are juxtaposed, and this juxtaposition has a special significance. The whole structure of the human organism depends upon this juxtaposition. In the organism of the state, the individual units or members are not contiguous like the individual cells in the human or individual or animal organism. That is out of the question. Yes, they are individual cells. They have different purposes, right? We have different purposes of things within you. You have red blood cells, you have white blood cells, you have T cells, you have muscle cells, you have a wide variety of things that are working together to create the organism that we are. We have like separate biomes. There is a biome that lives inside of your nostrils. There is a biome that lives inside of your gut. There is a different one that lives in your intestines. Both the large and the small. That is two separate biomes. And so, in large part, this logic is not correct, right? The cells of the human organism are juxtaposed, and the juxtaposition has a special significance. The whole structure of the organism depends on this juxtaposition. In the organism of the state, the individual units or members are not contiguous like the individual cells in the human or animal organism. They are not contiguous either. Some of them are in direct opposition of others. When your immune system is triggered, it can attack healthy things within you. That is out of the question. In the totality of the state, the human personality is something different from the cells in the organism. And even if at a pinch we compare the state with an organism, we must realize that we and the whole of political science are sorely mistaken if we overlook the fact that the individual is not a cell. Only the productive element in man can sustain the state, while the organism is an aggregate of cells, and it is they which determine its functioning. Therefore, the present state in which the group soul is no longer the same as the ancient times can only progress through the endeavor or initiative of a single individual. This cannot be compared with the functions of the cells. As a rule, it is immaterial to what we choose to compare, but if we make a comparison between two objects, they must be related objects. As a rule, it is accepted that analogies are valid to some extent, but they should not be so far-fetched as Kjellen's analogy. There is no objection to his comparing the state with an organism. One could equally well compare it with a machine. There is no harm in that. Or even with a penknife. Doubtless, points of similarity can be found here too. But if the comparison is carried through, it must be consistent. But people are not sufficiently familiar with the principles of logic to be aware of this. I think that this was an illogical argument, right? So I stated my case, right? There are differentiations between cells. They do act in concert at times and in discord at other times. It is a functioning body which has functioning cells. The organism does not function separated from the cells. With no people, there is no state. Yes, you should be in a healthy relationship with it, but it's not a necessity. Now, Kjellen is perfectly entitled to compare the state with an organism if he so wishes, but if he wishes to make this comparison, he must look for the right cells. But they cannot be found because the state has no cells. See, that is illogical. That's not true. If we think about matter concretely, this analogy breaks down. I simply wish to point out that one can only carry this analogy through if one thinks in an abstract way like Kjellin. The moment one thinks realistically, one demurs because the idea has no roots in reality. We find that the state has no cells. That's so not true. On the other hand, we discover that the individual states can perhaps be compared to cells, and that the sum total of states on Earth can be compared to an organism. No. A fruitful idea then occurs to us, but first we must answer the question, what kind of organism? Where can we find something comparable in the kingdom of nature where the cells fit into each other in the same way as the individual state cells fit into the entire organism of the earth? Pursuing this idea, we find that we can only compare the entire earth organism with a plant organism, not with an animal organism, and still less with a human organism. Whilst natural science is only concerned with the inorganic, with the mineral kingdom, political science must be founded on a higher order of ideals, on the ideas of the plant kingdom. We must look neither to the animal nor the human kingdom, and we must free ourselves from mineralized thinking, dead thought forms to which the scientists are so firmly attached. They cannot rise to the higher order of ideas embodied in the plant kingdom, but apply laws of the mineral kingdom to the state and call it political science. And again, I just don't find the logic in that. In order to arrive at this fruitful conception mentioned above, our whole thinking must be rooted in spiritual science. We shall then be able to satisfy ourselves that the whole being of man, by virtue of his individuality, is far superior to the state. He penetrates into the spiritual world where the state cannot enter. The state is not meant to enter into it. It's not an actual organism, right? Like, it is an analogy. I don't know if he understood what an analogy is at this point. Like, it is describing something in a way that can be readily understood, right? If you can conceptualize of what an organism is, that it is made up of a bunch of different cells, some of them acting independently of others, then you can understand that the state is an organism, and that the variety of states are individual organisms. But what he is trying to say here is that only the state itself can be the cell, and that the whole of all the states is the organism. Well, you have a liver. That serves a purpose. You have a pancreas, and it serves a different purpose, but they are part of the same organism. You have the United States. That is an organism. You have Canada. That is an entirely different organism, and they serve different purposes. So yes, they can be the organism of the whole world, but they can also be contained. They could be the biome, right? And so while the analogy may not be 100% accurate, it is much more accurate than what you are implying here, Mr. Steiner. If, therefore, you compare the state with an organism and the individual member of the state with the cells, then, if you think realistically, you will arrive at the idea of an organism consisting of individual cells, but the cells would everywhere extend beyond the epidermis. You would have an organism with cells which extends beyond the epidermis. The cells would develop independently of the organism and would be self-contained. We have cells that extend beyond the epidermis. Did you know that? Did you know that? Did you know that? You know what this is? This is cells. You know where the epidermis ends? At my scalp. This extends past my epidermis. Not far, because I cut it recently. Right? This is the same problem, right? This is a little bit better of an example because it's so long. The skin, that's the epidermis. This hair is cells. It is cells. This is some flawed logic. Flawed logic really gets me spun up. You would have an organism with cells which extend beyond the epidermis. The cells would develop independently of the organism and would be self-contained. You would therefore have to picture the organism as if living bristles, which felt themselves to be individuals, were everywhere projecting beyond the epidermis. Living thinking thus brings us into touch with reality and shows us the impossible difficulties that must face us if we wish to grasp any idea that is to be fruitful. It is not surprising, therefore, that ideas which are not impregnated with spiritual science have not the capacity to sustain us in coping with our present situation. For how can one reduce to order the chaos in the world if one has no idea of its cause? No matter how many Wilsonian manifestos are issued by all kinds of international organizations or associations and the like, so long as they have no roots in reality, they are so much empty talk. Hence, many proposals which are put forward today are a sheer waste of time. Now, we can go into Wilsonian, right? That can be a whole different topic because he was really trying to roll out something that probably should not have been allowed. But we're not going to deal with that here today. Here is an example which demonstrates how imperative it is that our present age should be permeated with the impulses of spiritual science. It is the tragedy of our time that it is powerless to develop ideas which could reconcile and control the organic life of the state. Hence, everything is in a state of chaos. But it must now be clear to you where the deeper causes of this chaos are to be sought. It is not surprising, therefore, that books such as Kiellen's The State of an as Organism conclude in the most remarkable manner. We are now living in an age where everybody is wondering what is to be done so that men may once again live in harmony, when with every week they are increasingly determined to live in enmity and to slaughter each other. How are they to be brought together again? But the science which deals with the question of how men are once again to develop social relationships within the state concludes in Kiellen's case with these words. This must be the conclusion of our inquiry into the state as organism. We have seen that for compelling reasons the state of today had made little progress in this direction and has not yet become fully aware that this is its function. Nonetheless, we believe in a higher form of state which recognizes a more clearly defined rational purpose and which will make determined efforts to achieve this goal. Now, we have an extremely hard time coming to that goal, right? We have a hard time agreeing on things. That is the state of humanity and has been forever. If you don't believe that and you are a Christian, you should definitely go back and check out the republic that was Israel. This is the concluding passage in his book, but we do not know. We have no idea what will come of it. Such are the findings of a painstaking and conscientious thinking that is so caught up in the stream of contemporary thought that it overlooks the essentials. One must face these problems squarely, for the impulse, the desire to gain insight into these problems only arises when we face them squarely, when we know what are the driving forces in our present age. Even without looking far beneath the surface, we perceive today an urge towards a kind of socialization. I do not mean towards socialism, but towards socialization of the Earth's organism. But socialization, because it must be conscious and not proceed from the unconscious as in the last 2,000 years. I wonder if maybe we could have had a guiding force that would actually brought us there. Socialization, reorientation, or reorganization is only possible if we understand the nature of man, if we now learn to know, once again, the being of man. For that was the object of the ancient mysteries. Socialization applies to the physical plane, but it is impossible to establish a social order if one ignores the fact that on the physical plane are to be found not only physical men, but men endowed with soul and spirit. Nothing can be achieved if we think of man only in physical terms. You may socialize, you may order social life in accordance with contemporary ideas, and within 20 years everything will be in chaos again, if you ignore the fact that man is not only the physical being known to natural science, but being endowed with a soul and spirit. For soul and spirit are active agents and exercise a powerful influence. We may ignore their existence in our ideas and representations, but we cannot abolish them. If the soul is to inhabit a physical body, which participates in a social order appropriate to our time, It must have freedom of thought and opinion. Yes. Socialization cannot be realized without freedom of thought. And socialization and freedom of thought cannot be realized unless the spirit is rooted in the spiritual world itself. Now, we are here for lessons and trials, and part of that is the fact that we will not agree on things here. If you are attempting to think that all people are going to come into accordance, you are sorely mistaken. The best that you can hope for is that your community is in accordance. Right? During the last 4 years ago particularly, back in 2020, if you understand the reference, there was a particular madness going around this country, and people were participating in it in varying levels of acceptance. Here, where I live, we didn't have to follow some of the strictures that were placed upon other people because this community is fairly like-minded. But even here, there is dissent, right? Where I am at in Walker, Louisiana, was remarkably free from fear. But right down the road, in the next town over, in the same parish, 5 miles away, they were ate up with fear. If you go in the other direction, it was the same thing. But here in this community, there was no problems. Nobody got in trouble for not doing the things which you should not have been doing in the first place. And so there will not be complete accord. That's not going to happen. The best that you can hope for is that your community is going to work towards your best interest. And if it doesn't, you should be locating yourself somewhere that will. Or formulating with your neighbors to make it happen. That is communalism, right? Not communism, where the state is in charge of things, but communalism, where your community plays a bigger part in the role outside. So I just wanted to make it clear that you are not going to get complete accordance on this physical plane. It doesn't matter what happens, right? Barring the bottleneck where everybody is going to look up and see this thing in the sky and they're going to be like, oh shit. And they're all going to be scared because that is the abomination which causes desolation. Is going to be a physical thing in the sky that everybody sees and it makes them afraid. At that point, we may come to some degree of coherence, but probably not. There will be wide dissension about what we should do about that thing. Some people are going to want to blow it up, and some people are going to want to go and blow themselves up. That is simply how it works. Freedom of thought as an attitude of mind or way of thinking, pneumatology, spiritual maturity, and spiritual science as scientific foundation of all ordinances and directives, these are inseparably linked. We can only discover through spiritual science how these things are related to man and how they can be realized practically in the social order. Like, that was throwing me off. I'm like, wait, what? Freedom of thought, that is, an attitude to one's neighbor that fully recognizes his freedom of thought, cannot be realized unless we accept the principle of reincarnation, for otherwise we look upon man as an abstraction. I don't know that that is necessarily logically sound either. We shall never see him in the right light unless we look upon him as the result of repeated lives on earth. Now, I agree with that, but it's not necessarily true. The whole question of reincarnation must be examined in connection with the question of freedom of thought and opinion. The life of man will be impossible in the future unless the inner life of the individual can be rooted in the life of the spirit. I am not suggesting that he must become clairvoyant, though this will certainly occur in individual cases, but I maintain that he must be firmly rooted in the life of the spirit. I have often explained that this is perfectly possible without becoming clairvoyant. If we look around a little, we shall find where the major hindrances lie and in what direction we must look for the source of these obstacles. It is not that people are unwilling to search for the truth, and as I have said, I do not wish to reprove or criticize, but they erect psychic barriers and are the victims of their many inhibitions. That is true. Often, an isolated instance is so instructive that we are able to gain real understanding of many contemporary phenomena from these symptoms. There is one symptom peculiar to our own time which is most remarkable. It is curious how people who are normally so brave and courageous today are terrified when they hear that the claims of spiritual knowledge are to be recognized. They are bewildered. I have often told you that I noticed that many who had attended one or two lectures were not seen again for some time. Meeting them in the street, I asked why they had never turned up again. "I dare not," came the reply. "I'm afraid you might convince me." That is a real thing. They find such a possibility dangerous and disturbing and are not prepared to expose themselves to the risk. I could cite many other examples of a similar kind from my own experience, but I prefer to give examples from the wider field of public life. I'll go ahead and talk about it in my personal life. Y'all know what I do here, right? If you're here for a long period of time, you know where I stand, but I have deconstructed myself from Christianity. That is a 161 video process which you can watch. But because of that particular process, I have knowledge, right? I have made a study and understood the things in which I was studying. And so, in my daily life, I often run into people who try to convince me otherwise. And I come to them with the facts of the things that I have learned, right? We talk about the actual things. They're like, "Well, why don't you believe?" And it's like, "Well, here, and here." And then they don't have a rebuttal on that. And so they just won't talk to you anymore. They are so firmly convinced that they are right, but they have no defense that they are right, that they just avoid the situation. I have a couple of my neighbors who are that way. It is funny because I don't care, right? You can be what you want to be. But if you ask me, I cannot lie to you, right? When I talk about God, right? God has effectively changed me. My neighbors have noticed it, right? When I started walking, it was a difficult thing for me. December 31st, 2019. I started walking and it took me 45 minutes to complete my first mile, right? When I finally started timing it, it took me 45 minutes. It was probably longer than that at the start. But through the course of what I do, it has gotten better and better. The voice thing, better and better. I can talk more and more every single day. And so it is a noticeable change in me. And people ask about it. They're like, "Man, I noticed that you went from walking quite slowly and now you were walking quite briskly. What's the difference?" I'm like, "Well, God changed my life. He helped me to heal myself." And so we enter into a discussion about how this physical thing has physically happened, and they can't take it. "What do you mean?" Well, they're like, "Well, you mean Jesus?" And I'm like, No, I absolutely do not." "Well, why do you say it like that?" "Well, because of this." And I'm not as brusque as I may come off here, right? I am a very flexible person. Here, this is my domain. This is my spot, and if I offend you, you're more than welcome to not be here. Knowledge is not for everybody, as much as I would like it to be. But out there in the real world, when I am dealing with real people in real time, I'm quite flexible. I will flex myself around you on a variety of ideas. I will attempt to accommodate your beliefs in pretty much anything. But if you ask me, my beliefs, I'm going to tell you, right? I believe in God with no intermediary. I had Jehovah's Witnesses come knock on my door the other day. I blew them out of the water. They left here completely confuddled. I am sure there was a discussion with the elders that they were not expecting when they left here. Because they asked me, it's like, "What do you believe?" And I said, "I believe in God. What I do is directly from God." And it completely blew them out of the water that I did not need an intermediary. Like a complete change of direction for their minds. Like they didn't even know what to say anymore. But we had a remarkably pleasant conversation for like 20 minutes. We were just talking. I am flexible around your ideas unless you ask me. But then when you ask me and I tell you, you just want to ignore me. You want to, "Nope, can't deal with that. Nope, can't deal with that." It's funny. And then, like, I've got one particular neighbor, he's a good guy. And we talked and this happened, and then he came back and he was like, he had prepared, right? He had talked to somebody else and he was ready. He came out to meet me as I'm walking down the road, and he's got the guy that he was talking to get prepared, sitting over there out of earshot, like just around the corner from emotional support. And then he started making his arguments, and I have the counter arguments for them. And it can, like, we haven't really talked since then. He goes out of his way to not greet me, right? He leaves a little bit earlier than he has to, or he waits a little bit longer than he should, so that we don't meet when I go walking. It's quite amusing, but it's understandable, right? What we do here is changing a paradigm, and that is the goal of it. And so I'm afraid you might convince me that is a very, very real thing. A short time ago, I spoke here of Herman Bahr. Note 5, let's go ahead and pop it out. Herman Bahr, 1863 to 1934, was an Austrian dramatist, novelist, and essayist. In his later years, he returned to the church and represented the Catholic school of thought, care of his novel Himmelfahrt. Himmelfahrt, huh? I am sure that means something in German, but that is funny. Who recently gave a lecture here in Berlin entitled The Ideas of 1914. I pointed out how he attempted, you need only read his last novel of Himmelfahrt. I'm such a child sometimes. Not only to move a little in the direction of spiritual science, but he even tried in his later years to arrive at an inner understanding of Goethe. That is, to follow the path which I would recommend to those who wish to provide themselves with a sound background for their introduction to spiritual science. There are very many today who would like to speak of the Spirit once again, who would welcome any and every opportunity to revive knowledge of the Spirit. I do not wish to lecture or criticize, least of all a person such as Herman Bahr, for whom I feel a great affection. But even if it is far from our intention to sermonize, we nonetheless have the strange feeling that an outlook such as that of Herman Bahr has contributed to the corruption of thought and has infected human thinking with original sin. Now, in his Berlin lecture, Herman Bahr expressed many fine and admirable sentiments, but many astonishing things came to light. He began by saying that this war has taught us something completely new. It had taught us to integrate the individual once again into the community in the right way, to sacrifice our individualism, our egocentricity for the benefit of the whole. This war has taught us, he said, to make a clean sweep of the past with its antiquated ideas, and to fill our inner life with something completely new. And he proceeded to describe the inestimable benefits this war has brought us. I have no wish to criticize, quite the reverse. But after a lengthy disquisition on how the war has transformed us all, how we shall be completely changed through the war, it is strange to come upon the concluding passage. Man always cherishes hope of a better future, but remains himself incorrigible. Even the war will leave us much as we are. As I said before, I have no wish to criticize, but I cannot help being touched by these high hopes. These people are motivated by the best of intentions. They wish to find once again the path to the spiritual. And Bahr, therefore, emphasized that we had relied too much upon the individual. We had practiced the cult of individualism far too long. I would say no. We must learn, once again, to surrender to the whole. Now that is in part true, right? You should be self-sacrificing, not to the degree where you have nothing left to sacrifice, but you should be with concern for the whole organism. We must learn, once again, to surrender to the whole. Those who belong to a nation have learned to merge with the nation, to sacrifice their separativeness, and nations, too, he believes, are only totalities of individual characteristics, parts of the greater whole which will later emerge. Thus, Bahr sometimes betrays, and especially in this lecture, the path he nonetheless follows in order to arrive at the Spirit. Sometimes he gives only vague indications, and these indications are most revealing. Ring out the old, the past is dead, is his motto. The Aufklärung wished to found everything on the basis of reason, but all to no purpose. Everything has ended in chaos. We must find something that brings us in touch with reality and saves us from chaos. In this context, Bahr once again makes astonishing revelations. Perhaps nations and individuals would then have learned what is most difficult for them to learn, to grant to others the right to individuality that each individual claims himself. For in the final analysis, the individuality of others is the precondition of one's own. If we were all alike, there would be no distinguishing features, and they would have learned that just as each individual with his distinctive gifts in his own particular field is necessary to the nation, in order through his self-fulfillment to sustain the nation and thus at the same time be self-sufficient, and also to serve the nation, so too the universality of mankind, the common membership of all mankind that reaches to the divine, grows out of nations and transcends nations. That is a hint, not a broad hint. At least it is, if not a broad hint, at least it is a clear hint. People are striving to find the way to God, but are unwilling to follow the path that is appropriate to our time. They are looking for a different path which already exists. But it never occurs to them that this traditional path was indeed effective up to 1914. And now, in order to obviate its consequences, they want to return to it again. If it was effective up to 1914, more people would know. The symptoms manifested here, I think, deserving of quiet examination. For these are the views, not of a single individual, but of a vast number of people who feel and think this way. A book by Max Scheler, Note 6. Max Scheler, 1874 to 1928, was a professor of philosophy at Cologne, 1920 to 21. His writings have a strong theistic flavor, and he was a subtle advocate of Catholicism. It's probably why he only lasted 1 year in his teaching. Recently appeared with the title Der Genius des Krieges and Der Deutschkrieg. It is a good book, and I can safely recommend it. Barr, too, thinks highly of it. He is a man of taste and well-informed and has every reason to commend it. But he also wishes to publicize the book and proposes to write a highly favorable review, a puff to boost Scheler. He wonders how best to proceed. To scandalize the public is not the right approach. Some other way must be found to attract their attention. What was he to do? Now, Hermann Bahr is a very sincere and honest man, and leaves no doubt as to what he would do in such a case. In his article on Scheler, he begins by saying, Scheler has written many articles to show how we could escape from our present predicament. Scheler caught the public eye, but, says Bahr, people today do not approve of being told whom to read. It goes against the grain. And so Hermann Bahr characterizes Scheler in the following way. People were curious about him, and yet rather suspicious of him. We Germans want to know above all where we stand in relation to an author. We do not like indefinition. Let us therefore have a clear picture. This is not achieved by reading books and accepting their arguments. Something more is needed. Bahr now gives a further hint. Even the Catholics preferred to preserve judgment on Scheler lest they should be disappointed. His idiom displeased them. For every mental climate creates in the course of time its own native idiom, which gives a particular flavor and meaning to words of common usage. In this way, one recognizes who belongs, with the result that ultimately one pays less attention to what is said than to how it is said. Hermann Bahr decided to announce Scheler with a flourish of trumpets. Now, like Bahr himself, Scheler hints at these remarkable Catholicizing endeavors. Always tentatively at first, he never commits himself immediately. Now, according to Bahr, Scheler does not speak like a genuine Catholic, but Catholics want to know where they stand in relation to Scheler, and especially Bahr himself, since he intends to puff Scheler in the Catholic periodical Deutschland. After all, people must know that Scheler can be safely recommended to Catholics. They do not like to be left in the dark. They want to know the truth. And this is the crux of the matter. People will know where they stand if they are told that it is perfectly safe for Catholics to read Scheler. The fact that he is exceptionally clever and witty is of no consequence. Catholics have no objection to that. I would beg to differ. Bahr, however, proposes to hold up Scheler as an outstanding personality in order to boost his importance, but at the same time he does not wish to offend people. First of all, he bewails the fact that mankind has become empty and vapid, that man has lost all connection with the spirit. But he must find his way back to the spirit once again. I quote a few passages from Hermann Bahr on Scheller when I touch upon this subject. Reason broke away from the church and arrogantly assumed that of itself it could understand, determine, order, command, shape, and direct life. It was doing it before the church. Hermann Bahr lacks the courage to say reason must now seek contact with the spiritual world. He therefore says reason must look to the church once again, and the church and the spiritual world are not necessarily the same thing. Reason broke away from the church and arrogantly assumed that of itself it could understand, determine, order, command, and shape and direct life. Reason, had scarcely begun to take the first steps in this direction, than it took fright and lost confidence in itself. This self-awareness of reason, the consciousness of its boundaries, of the limitations of its own power, when bereft of divine apparatus, began with Kant. He recognized that reason of itself cannot achieve that which is by its very nature it is constrained to will. It cannot achieve the goal it has set for itself. He called a halt to reason at the very moment when it promised to be fruitful. Kant set boundaries to reason, but his disciples extended those boundaries, and each went his own way. Ultimately, godless reason had no other choice but to abdicate. It realized finally that it can know nothing. It searched for truth so long until it discovered that either truth was non-existent or that there was no truth to which man could attain. Enough has now been said in defense of the modern outlook and all those fine sentiments about the boundaries of knowledge. Since that time we have lived without truth, believing there is no truth. We continue to live, however, as if truth must nonetheless exist. In fact, in order to live, we had to live by denying our reason. So we preferred to abandon reason completely. We committed intellectual suicide. Soon man was regarded simply as a bundle of impulses. He was proud of his dehumanization, and the consequence was 1914. Just wait a couple years. And so Hermann Bahr praises Scheller because of his Catholicizing bent. Then he proceeds to give a somewhat distorted picture of Goethe, for he had been at pains for some time to depict him as a dyed-in-the-wool Catholic, and then goes on to say, the modern scientist denied his spiritual birthright. Science abandoned presuppositions. Reason no longer derived from the divine the impulse which is imperative for its effectiveness. What other path was open to it? None, save the appeal of the instincts. The man was established values was suspended over an abyss, and the result was 1914. If we are to build afresh, it must be from totally new foundations, or really old ones. If we are to bring about a spiritual renewal, we must make a complete break with the past. It would be presumptuous to aim at the immediate spiritual rehabilitation of Europe. We must first rehabilitate man and restore his lost innocence. We must become aware once again that he is a member of the spiritual world. Freedom, individuality, dignity, morality, science, and art have vanished from the world since faith, hope, and love are no more. And only faith, hope, and love can restore them. We have no other choice, either the end of the world or omnia instituere in Christo, to renew all things in Christ. But this omnia instituere in Christo does not imply a search for the Spirit and move towards the investigation or exploration of the Spirit, but the inclusion of the nations in the Catholic fold. How is it, Bahr asks, that men are able to think for themselves and yet are able to remain good Catholics? We must look at those who are suited to the present age. If Scheller fits the bill, for he is not such a fool as to speak, for example, of an evolution into the spiritual world, or to specify a particular spiritual teaching. He is not such a fool as to commit himself openly, as is the case with those who speak of the Spirit and then suggest, the rest will he added unto you if you enter the church. An example, the Catholic Church, for that is implied both by Bahr and Scheller, which, in their opinion, is sufficiently all-embracing. In this way, conflicting opinions can be reconciled under the umbrella of the Church. Nonetheless, people today want to think for themselves, and Scheller adapts himself to their thoughts. Indeed, Bahr believes that Scheller is in this respect is a master of giving people what they want. Scheller attracts attention because he does not gesticulate or raise his voice. Involuntarily, people ask, who can it be who appears to be so sure of his influence that he does not feel it necessary to raise his voice? It is a favorite device of seasoned orators to open up on a quiet note and thus command the silent attention of the audience. The orator must also have the power to hold them spellbound. Scheller can do this in a masterly fashion. He so captivates his listeners that the listener is unaware whither he is being led, and suddenly finds himself at a destination that was wholly unforeseen. Starting from unexpected propositions which the listener innocently accepts, Scheller forces him imperceptibly to conclusions which he would have actively resisted had he been in any way forewarned. In this respect, Scheller's art of persuasion is unrivaled. He is a born educator. I know of no one who can lead us so easily but firmly to the truth. Indeed, it is a special art to be able to take people by surprise in this way. First, one makes statements that are unexceptionable. Then the argument proceeds slowly and leads to a conclusion at which the audience would have demurred had they been aware of it from the start. How does one account for this, Baer asked, and what must be done in order to act with the right intentions? In this review of Scheller, Baer gives his honest and candid opinion. The question now is whether the average German can grasp the magnitude of the moment and all that it pretends. He is animated by the best of intentions, but still fondly imagines that belief is no longer possible for modern man, since it has been scientifically refuted. He does not suspect that this science or dogma of unbelief has itself been refuted scientifically. He knows nothing of quiet preparatory work in this direction of the outstanding German philosophers of our time, Lotze, Franz Brentano, Diethely, Eucken, and Husserl. Note 7, we are going to pop that out. Lotze, 1817 to 81, Diethely, 1833 to 1911, R. Eucken, 1846 to 1929. Husserl, 1859 to 1938, were philosophers of idealism. They were opposed to the mechanistic scientific philosophy of the age and pleaded the cause of ethical idealism. Now, I plead the cause of ethical capitalism. I don't believe that it has been implemented. I am asking to be the example of it, so I understand a little bit what you're talking about there. I now beg you to give the special attention to the following. The ordinary person which hears in the last faint echo of the Munchausen postern the latest aberration, which, unbeknown to him, has already been refuted. Amidst this confusion, a calm, clear voice will soon be heard, which gives no suspicion of the sentimental daydreaming, romanticism, or mysticism which fills the ordinary person with unholy dread. And precisely because Scheller pleads the cause of a recovery of faith straightforwardly and unemotionally, and in customary jargon of the cultivated man of our time, he is the man we need today. So now we know. Now we know why Baer approves of Scheller. He, Scheller, cannot be accused of being a visionary or a mystic, for the average German is mortally afraid of them. And woe betide anyone who does not respect this fear, for if he were to take it into his head to banish this fear and recognize the need to struggle against it, it would need more than a little courage to venture on such an undertaking. Because I have great respect and affection for Hermann Baer, I would like to show that he is typical of those who find great difficulty in accepting a spiritual teaching of which our time stands in need. But there is promise of hope only if we overcome that terrible fear, if we have the courage to acknowledge that spiritual science is not an idle fancy, that the greatest clarity of thought is called for if we wish to make the right approach to spiritual science. For there is little evidence of clear thinking in the few examples which I have quoted to you today from Hermann Baer and other contemporary writers. I agree. Spiritual courage is called for if we wish to develop the ideas that are strong and effective. We need not go all the way to Nietzsche, nor do we need to wholly share the view he expresses in the passage, which nonetheless may attract our attention. But when this sensitive spirit, stimulated perhaps by his illness, expresses his boldest and most courageous opinions, we must nevertheless go along with him. The fear of being misunderstood must not deter us. It would be the greatest calamity that would befall us today if we were to be afraid of being misunderstood. We must sometimes, perhaps, pass judgments like the following judgment of Nietzsche, even though it may not be sound in every detail. That is not important. On his treatise on the history of Christianity, he wrote, Christianity as a historical reality must not be confused with that one root which its name recalls. The other roots from which it has sprung are by far more important. It is an unprecedented abuse of language to associate such manifestations of decay and such monstrosities as the Christian church, Christian belief, and the Christian life with that holy name. What did Christ deny? Everything which today is called Christian. Although this is perhaps an extreme view, Nietzsche nevertheless touched upon something which has a certain truth, but he expressed it somewhat radically. It is true to the extent that one could say, what would Christ most vigorously condemn if he were to appear in our midst today? Most probably what the majority of people call Christian today, and much else besides, which I will discuss in our lecture on Tuesday next. And so we are going to wrap up our study of Lecture 9. And once again, I don't have a whole lot to add to the end, right? We're going to do a wrap-up, but I feel like I have expressed my discontent with the various points as we went along, and there's no need for me to go further. So hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult set of topics. Hopefully you understand that my point is to bring us to this spiritual science that he is talking about. I do believe that there is a spiritual path. I am walking it. I also believe in science. I have participated in it. The two are not necessarily separate. They are intrinsic. And until we accept the intrinsicness of it, we're not really going to get a full understanding of anything. We can contemplate, but the very core of everything is the spiritual. That is my firmly held belief, and that is where I stand. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, share, and a sub. Throw me a comment if you agree or disagree. If it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. And if there is something you would like to see me talk about in the manner that we are doing here today, let me know in the comments down below as well. If you really like what I'm doing, hit me with that super thanks. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you were here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt State. Peace.